My name is Sloane Whitaker. I am 34 years old. And the first time my husband Theodore introduced me to one of his investors at a charity dinner in Atlanta in the spring of last year, he introduced me as his wife. Just that. His wife. He did not say my name. He did not say what I did for a living. He did not mention that I had built and sold a software company 3 years earlier for an amount of money that, if my husband Theodore had bothered to find out, would have closed his mouth for the rest of the evening. He did not bother to find out. That was Theodore's whole problem in a single sentence. He never bothered to find out. I want to tell you a story tonight that begins in a luxury car showroom on a Tuesday afternoon in October and ends, 11 months later, in the same showroom, with my husband Theodore, standing very still beside a black Ferrari, looking at his phone, while the silver Porsche behind him was being loaded onto a flatbed truck by a repossession crew he had not been informed was coming. Between those 2 Tuesdays, my life rearranged itself completely. Stay with me. This one is going to take a while, and I promise you, by the end, you will understand exactly what it means when a man marries a woman without bothering to find out who she actually is. If this is your first time here, my name is Sloane. Welcome. Drop your city in the comments. Drop the time you are watching. I read every single comment in the early morning before the rest of the house wakes up, and your words tell me who I am sitting with at this table. Let me take you back to that first Tuesday, October 14th, Atlanta, in a luxury car showroom on Piedmont Road called Carrington Motors. The building was the kind of building that has more glass than wall, lit from inside the way museums are lit, with a marble floor that had been imported from a quarry in northern Italy, specifically because the showroom's owner believed that the floor a man stood on while he made a purchase of significant size should communicate something about the gravity of the moment. The owner of Carrington Motors was my husband Theodore. I was 33 years old that day. I was standing in the corner of the showroom near the espresso bar that Theodore had installed 2 years earlier, because, he said, men of a certain caliber expected proper espresso when they were spending 6 figures on an automobile, and I had come in to drop off a sandwich that Theodore had texted me to bring him because, he said, he was going to be in meetings until late, and the staff was busy, and he was hungry. I was, in this period of my life, the kind of wife who brought my husband sandwiches on a Tuesday afternoon. I want you to hold that detail. The sandwich, the Tuesday, the wife in the corner near the espresso bar, because the woman who walked into Carrington Motors that afternoon and the woman who walked out of it 11 months later were not the same woman. And the sandwich, in retrospect, was the last meaningful object the first woman ever delivered. I was in the corner. Theodore was at the desk in the showroom office. I could see him through the glass wall that separated the office from the floor. He was on a phone call. He was laughing in the specific way Theodore laughed when he was talking to someone he wanted something from. The laugh that pulled his shoulders forward and made his head tilt to the right. The laugh that I had once, when I was 26 and we were dating, found magnetic. I was waiting for him to finish the phone call. While I waited, a woman came into the showroom. She was perhaps 30 years old. She had dark hair pulled back into the kind of low ponytail that women wear when they want to be taken seriously, without making the effort feel performed. She was wearing a charcoal pantsuit and the specific shade of red lipstick that I had never been able to wear without looking like I was trying to be someone other than myself. She walked across the marble floor with the easy, unhurried confidence of a woman who knew the building. And she did not look at me. She walked directly to the office where Theodore was on the phone. She knocked on the glass. Theodore looked up. He saw her. His face did something I had never seen it do in 9 years of marriage. He did not smile exactly. His face arranged itself into the specific expression of a man who has been caught at the precise edge of something he has not yet decided how to handle. He hung up the phone. He came out of the office. He kissed her on the cheek. Not the way he kissed business associates. Not the way he kissed cousins at family gatherings. He kissed her the way a man kisses a woman he has been kissing in private for a long time, and has begun to forget that the kiss in public requires a different choreography. She put her hand on his arm. She left it there, and I stood in the corner near the espresso bar with the sandwich in my hand. Theodore turned. He saw me. His face did the second thing I had never seen it do in 9 years of marriage. It did the specific, quick rearrangement of a man who has just realized he made a calculation error and is now, in real time, recalculating everything that follows from it. He walked toward me. The woman with the dark ponytail stayed by the office. She had not yet noticed me. She was looking at her phone. Theodore said, "Sloane, you're here." I said, "I brought your sandwich." He said, "I forgot you were coming." I said, "I texted you when I parked." He said, "I must not have seen it." He took the sandwich from my hand. He did not look at the sandwich. He was looking at the space behind my left ear, and which is what Theodore looked at when he was trying to make me believe something he himself had not yet finished making up. I said, "Who is that?" He said, "Who?" I said, "The woman by your office. The one you just kissed." He said, "That is Camille. She is one of our consignment specialists." I said, "I have not met her." He said, "She started 2 months ago." I said, "You kissed her on the cheek when she came in." He said, "It is a European thing. She lived in Milan for 6 years. The greeting is cultural." I held Theodore's eye for a moment. I said, "Theodore, I lived in Milan for a year when I was 22. The greeting is 2 cheeks, not 1, and it is not done with the hand on the arm." Theodore said, "Sloane, don't make this weird." I said, "I am not making it weird, Theodore. I am making an observation." And he said, "I have a lot of meetings this afternoon. I will see you at home." He turned. He walked back to the office. The woman called Camille looked up from her phone. She saw me. Her face did the third thing I had never seen anyone's face do in 9 years of marriage. It did not flinch. It did not look guilty. It did not even look surprised. It looked at me with the specific assessment of a woman who has been told that the wife is not a problem, and who is now confirming, with her own eyes, that the assessment was correct. She turned back to her phone. I left the showroom. I drove home. I drove the long way, and I drove past the lake, and through the neighborhood where Theodore and I had bought our first house together when we were 28 years old, and he had been a regional sales manager at a German auto importer, and I had been 3 years into building the company that I would, 2 years later, sell to a private equity firm in Boston for a number that I have never once said out loud to my husband Theodore. I want to tell you about that company. I want to tell you because the company is the part of this story that Theodore did not know about, and the part of the story that Theodore did not know about is the part that, 11 months later, walked into Carrington Motors with a black leather portfolio and ended my husband's entire understanding of who his wife had been The whole time he was kissing Camille on one cheek instead of two. I started the company when I was 24 years old. I was working at a logistics firm in Atlanta. I had a degree in computer science from Georgia Tech and a side project that I had been building on weekends. A piece of inventory management software designed specifically for independent dealerships of high-end specialty vehicles. Boats, motorcycles, small aircraft, luxury cars. The software solved a specific problem that nobody had bothered to solve correctly because the market was too small to interest the large enterprise software companies and too technical to interest the small ones. I built it because I had spent 2 years watching independent dealers lose money to inefficiencies that a properly designed system could have eliminated in a single afternoon. I sold the first license in 2014 for $900. I sold the 100th license in 2016 for $1,400 each. By 2018, I had 11 employees, a small office in a renovated warehouse in the old 4th Ward neighborhood, and a customer base of 340 independent dealerships across the United States and Canada. I had not told Theodore. I want to be careful here, because the way I just said that, I had not told Theodore, sounds like a confession of something. It is not. Theodore knew I had a job. Theodore knew I worked in software. Theodore knew that I went to an office most days and came home most evenings. What Theodore did not know was the specific scale of what I had built, because Theodore had never asked, and because by the time I realized he was never going to ask, I had begun to understand that the not asking was, itself, like a piece of information about my marriage that I needed to file away and consider carefully before deciding what to do with it. So I did not tell him. I did not lie. I simply did not volunteer. When Theodore asked, on the rare occasions when he asked, how work was going, I said it was going fine. When Theodore asked what I was working on, I said I was working on inventory systems. When Theodore asked, once, in 2019, whether I made enough money to cover my own car payment, I told him I did. And he said good, because the dealership was tight that month. Theodore was not stupid. Theodore was not cruel. Theodore was something more specific and more difficult to describe. Theodore was a man who had built his entire identity on the idea that he was the financial center of his household, and any information that contradicted that identity caused a small but persistent disturbance in his face that I had learned, over 9 years of marriage, to avoid generating. I had built an entire company without generating that disturbance. In June of 2020, a private equity firm in Boston named Ascentia Partners contacted me about an acquisition. They had identified my software as a strategic addition to a portfolio they were assembling in the specialty retail technology space. The conversation that began that June lasted 11 months. The conversation that began that June ended in May of 2021 with a wire transfer to a holding company I had set up in Delaware for the purpose of receiving it. The amount of the wire transfer was a number that I am going to share with you, because the number is part of the story, and because the woman I was when I received the wire transfer, and the woman I was when I drove home from Carrington Motors, with a sandwich in my passenger seat, are the same woman. And the discrepancy between what Theodore thought I had and what I actually had is the engine of everything that comes next. The wire transfer was for $47 million. After taxes and fees and the payouts to my 11 employees who had vested equity, the amount that landed in the Delaware holding company was approximately $29 million. I was 31 years old. I did not tell Theodore. I did not tell my mother. I did not tell my sister. I did not tell my best friend. I told my attorney, who had been my attorney since the founding of the company. I told my accountant, who had been my accountant since the first quarter we had revenue. I told the financial advisor I had retained 18 months earlier in anticipation of exactly this event. I did not tell my husband. I want you to hold that detail. I did not tell my husband. For the first 6 months after the wire transfer, I waited. I waited because I was not yet sure what I was waiting for. I waited because the act of telling Theodore felt like the wrong thing to do, for reasons I could not yet articulate. I waited because the company I had built had been mine, alone, for 7 years, and I was not yet ready to release the privacy of that ownership into a marriage that had not, in the previous 7 years, demonstrated the specific reliability that would make sharing safe. By the time the 7th month rolled around, I understood why I had been waiting, and I had been waiting because, somewhere in the part of myself that knew things before my mind was ready to admit them, I had already begun to suspect that my husband was not faithful. I had not yet found Camille. I had not yet seen the kiss in the showroom. But I had been noticing things for almost a year. The phone he held a little too close to his chest. The trips to dealer auctions in cities where there were no dealer auctions scheduled. The receipts that did not quite match the explanations. The way Theodore had begun to come home from work on Thursday evenings with the specific freshly showered cleanliness of a man who has not been showering at home. I had been collecting these observations the way a person collects buttons in a jar, without knowing yet what I was going to do with them, without naming what they were, and the Tuesday in the showroom was the Tuesday I named what they were. I went home from Carrington Motors that afternoon. I sat in my car in the driveway for almost an hour. The sun was beginning to set. The light was doing the particular gold and pink thing that the Atlanta sky does in October. The light my mother used to call the magic hour. The light that, in my childhood, had meant the day was ending, and the family was about to gather for dinner, and the world was, at least temporarily, in its proper arrangement. I sat in the car. I let the magic hour finish. When the light had gone the specific blue it goes after the gold has finished, I picked up my phone. I did not call Theodore. I did not call my mother. I did not call my sister. I called a woman named Hadley Bishop. That Hadley Bishop was the attorney who had handled the sale of my company. She had been my attorney since I was 27 years old. She was 41. She practiced corporate law at a small boutique firm in Atlanta that she had founded with 2 other women 6 years earlier. She was the kind of attorney who answered her own phone, even after hours, even on a Tuesday in October, when she had no reason to expect a call from a client whose acquisition had closed 11 months earlier. She answered on the second ring. She said, "Sloane." I said, "Hadley. I need to come in tomorrow morning." She said, "What time?" I said, "Whatever time you have." She said, 8:30. My office. Coffee will be ready." I said, "Hadley, I have not yet told my husband about the sale." There was a pause on the other end of the phone. She said, "Sloane, are you safe right now?" I said, "I am safe." She said, "Are you home?" I said, "I am in the driveway." She said, "Is Theodore home?" I said, "Not yet." She said, "Sloane, listen to me carefully. Go inside, pack a small bag, go to a hotel, not the Four Seasons. and not the St. Regis. Somewhere Theodore would not think to look for you. Pay in cash if you can. Do not tell anyone where you are. I will see you in the morning." I said, "Hadley, I have not even told you what I saw today." She said, "You called me at 6 in the evening on a Tuesday and told me you have not yet told your husband about the sale of your company. I do not need to know what you saw today. I need you in a hotel tonight. We will talk in the morning." I went inside the house. I packed a small bag. I left a note on the kitchen counter that said I had gone to my sister's because she was having a difficult night and would explain when I got home. I drove to a small hotel in Decatur that Theodore had never been to and would never have looked for. I paid in cash for 2 nights. I sat on the edge of the bed in the small hotel room with the small bag at my feet, and I did not cry, and I did not call my sister, and I did not call my mother, and I did not eat the sandwich that I had not delivered. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I thought about the woman in the charcoal pantsuit with the red lipstick, and I thought about the way Theodore had looked at the space behind my left ear, and I thought about the $29 million in the Delaware holding company that my husband did not know existed. And I thought, very clearly, is the first clear thought I had thought in 11 months. I thought, he has no idea who I am. I thought it not as a complaint. I thought it as an observation. I thought it again. He has no idea who I am. And then I thought a second thing. And the second thing was the thing that decided everything that came next. I thought, I am going to let him find out the way he deserves to find out. I turned off the lamp. I lay down on the small hotel bed in my clothes. I slept the deepest sleep I had slept in 11 months. I met Hadley at her office at 8:30 the next morning. The office was on the 11th floor of a building in Buckhead. Glass walls, modern furniture, at the specific, careful design of a workplace that has been arranged by women who understood that the seriousness of their work needed to be communicated in the architecture of the room before a single word was spoken. Hadley was at the door when the elevator opened. She was wearing what Hadley always wore: black trousers, white silk blouse, the silver watch her grandmother had given her on her 30th birthday. She walked me to her office. She closed the door. She did not sit down behind her desk. She sat in one of the 2 armchairs by the window, and she gestured for me to sit in the other. She said, "Tell me what happened." I told her. I told her about the showroom. I told her about Camille. I told her about the kiss. I told her about the way Theodore had looked at the space behind my left ear when he was lying, and I told her about the 11 months of suspicion that I had been carrying like a button collection in a jar, without yet naming what the buttons were. I told her about the $29 million. I told her about the 11 months I had not told Theodore. When I was finished, Hadley did not speak immediately. She drank her coffee. She looked at me with the specific, patient attention of a woman who has heard many versions of this conversation, and who knows that the next sentence she says is going to determine the shape of the next year of my life. Finally, she said, "Sloane, I want to ask you a question. I want you to think about your answer carefully." I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you want to leave him?" I sat with the question. I let it land. I let it sit in the part of my body that knew things before my mind was ready to know them. And I said, "I want to know what he has been doing for the last 11 months. I want to know who Camille is. I want to know whether there are other women. I want to know what has been happening to the money in our joint accounts. I want to know whether the man I married 8 years ago still exists, and if he does not, I want to know when he stopped existing. I said, and then, when I know all of those things, I want to decide. Hadley said, that is the right answer. She set down her coffee. She said, Sloane, we are going to make a plan. The plan has 3 parts. The first part is information gathering. We need to know exactly what Theodore has been doing, where the money has been going, and whether there are legal exposures we need to be aware of before we make any move. The second part is preservation, and we need to make sure that the assets you have, the assets that are properly yours from the sale of your company, the assets that are properly joint from the marriage, are protected from any action Theodore might take if he becomes aware that you are aware. The third part is leverage. I said, leverage. She said, leverage. Sloane, you are sitting on $29 million that your husband does not know about. That is the most valuable piece of information in this entire situation. We do not waste it. We use it carefully. We use it at the right moment for the right purpose. Until we use it, nobody knows about it. Not your sister, not your mother, not your best friend. Nobody. I said, Hadley. He is going to find out eventually. She said, yes, he is. The question is when, and on whose terms, and in what context. And right now, those answers are entirely in your control. They will not be in your control for very long. We need to use the window we have. I said, how long is the window? She said, I do not know. That depends on Theodore. That depends on whether he is currently planning to leave you. That depends on whether his arrangement with Camille is something he intends to formalize. That depends on a lot of things we do not yet know, which is why information gathering is the first phase. I said, how do we gather information? She said, we hire a man named Roman Castellanos. He is a private investigator. He is a friend of mine. He used to be FBI. He is the most discreet person I have ever worked with. He will spend the next 90 days documenting everything Theodore does, everywhere Theodore goes, every person Theodore meets with, and every transaction Theodore makes. At the end of 90 days, we will know exactly what we are dealing with. I said, 90 days is a long time. Hadley said, 90 days is exactly right. 90 days is long enough to establish a pattern. 90 days is short enough that the situation does not have time to change in ways we cannot anticipate. 90 days is also, by no coincidence, the length of time it takes to file the necessary preservation documents and to put the legal architecture in place that will protect you when the moment comes. She paused. She said, Sloane, there is one more thing. I said, yes. She said, for the next 90 days, you go home tonight. You go home as if nothing has happened. You make Theodore his dinner. You ask about his day. You laugh at his jokes. You do not let him sense, for 1 second, that you have noticed anything at all. Can you do that? I sat with the question. I thought about the 9 years of marriage. I thought about the sandwich I had brought him on Tuesday. I thought about the woman in the corner near the espresso bar who had been the wife who brought sandwiches. I said, Hadley, I have been pretending Theodore was a different husband than the husband he actually is for the past 4 years. I can pretend for 90 more days. Hadley said, good. She said, then we begin. For the next 90 days, I lived 2 lives. By day, I was Sloane Whitaker, the wife, the woman in the corner near the espresso bar, the woman who brought sandwiches, and the woman who made Theodore's dinner and asked about his day and laughed at his jokes and went to the dealership's holiday party in early December and made polite conversation with Camille, who had been introduced to me formally by Theodore at the party as the consignment specialist who had started 2 months earlier, and who, Theodore informed me without any apparent awareness of the irony, had been doing excellent work. I shook Camille's hand at the party. She shook mine. She wore a black dress. She wore the same red lipstick she had worn the day in the showroom. She looked at me with the specific, careful assessment of a woman who was trying to determine, in a single handshake, whether the wife had figured anything out yet. The wife, on the surface, had not figured anything out yet. The wife, underneath the surface, had figured out everything. Roman Castellanos delivered his first weekly report to Hadley's office on a Friday morning in late October. I sat in the same armchair by the window where I had sat the morning after the showroom. Hadley sat across from me. Roman stood by the door. Roman was a tall man in his early 50s who wore brown corduroy and looked like a college professor, and who had, Hadley had told me, the highest case closure rate in the southeastern United States for matrimonial investigations involving high net worth subjects. Roman said, "Mrs. Whitaker, your husband is in a relationship with Camille Dupré. The relationship has been ongoing for approximately 14 months. They meet at her apartment in a building on Peachtree Street that your husband owns through an LLC. He pays her rent, and he has been paying her rent since approximately August of the year before last." I said, "My husband owns the building." Roman said, "He owns the LLC that owns the building. The LLC was registered in Nevada 3 years ago. It is owned by a holding company in Wyoming. The holding company is owned by your husband. The building has 6 units. Camille Dupré lives in Unit 4B. The other 5 units are rented to tenants at market rates and generate approximately $31,000 a month in rental income that your husband has not, as far as we have been able to determine, declared on his joint tax filings." I sat with that. Roman said, "Mrs. Whitaker, there is more. I want you to be ready." I said, "Tell me." Roman said, "The Wyoming Holding Company also owns 3 other properties, 2 in Atlanta, 1 in Asheville. Should the total estimated value of the real estate holdings, based on current market comparables, is approximately $4.6 million. None of these holdings appear in your husband's personal financial statements or in the dealership's books." I said, "He has been hiding $4.6 million in real estate." Roman said, "At a minimum." He paused. Roman said, "Mrs. Whitaker, there is one more thing." I said, "Yes." Roman said, "We have identified a draft separation agreement on your husband's personal email. The draft is dated 2 weeks ago. It was prepared by an attorney named Bradford Kemp, who practices family law in Buckhead. The draft proposes a separation in which you would receive the marital home, a one-time payment of $300,000, and 4 years of spousal support at $6,000 a month, and your husband would retain the dealership-related real estate, and what the document refers to as his personal investments." I said, "Personal investments." Roman said, "Yes." I said, "The Wyoming Holding Company." Roman said, "Yes." I said, "He intends to file." Roman said, "He intends to file. Based on the date of the draft and the timeline of his communications with Mr. Kemp, our assessment is that he intends to file in early February, approximately 90 days from now." I almost laughed. The window Hadley had identified 90 days ago, when she had told me we needed exactly 90 days for information gathering, was the same window Theodore had identified. He had been preparing a separation. We had been preparing a defense. The two of us in the same house, eating dinner across the same table. Chet had been counting down the same 90 days from opposite sides of the marriage. Hadley said, "Mrs. Whitaker, we are going to file first." I said, "When?" Hadley said, "We need 3 more weeks of documentation to make the case airtight. After that, we file. We will file on a Friday afternoon. Specifically, we will file on a Friday afternoon that coincides with an event Theodore is hosting at the dealership, so that the news of the filing reaches him in a setting where his ability to respond strategically will be maximally compromised." I said, "Hadley." Hadley said, "That is exactly what he was planning to do to you. The only difference is that we are doing it first, and we are doing it correctly." She looked at me. She said, "Sloane, there is something else I need to discuss with you. About the 29 million. I said, "Yes," she said. "Theodore does not know about the 29 million. Roman has confirmed that. He has accessed your personal email and your personal accounts, and there is no indication that he is aware of the sale of the company. As far as Theodore knows, you are a software developer who makes a moderate salary and who has a small retirement account." I said, "Yes." She said, "When we file, we have a choice. We can file in a way that discloses the 29 million as part of your separate property, which it is, since you sold the company before the marriage entered the period where new earnings would have been considered marital. Or we can file in a way that does not initially disclose it, that lets the proceedings move forward with Theodore believing that you have only the assets he has been aware of, and in that introduces the 29 million only, at the moment when its introduction will have the maximum corrective effect." I said, "Which option do you recommend?" Hadley said, "Sloane, I cannot recommend one over the other. They are both legally defensible. The first option is faster and cleaner. The second option is slower and more theatrical, and carries a small risk of being characterized as bad faith if it is challenged." I said, "Theodore intends to lowball me at $300,000 and 4 years of spousal support." Hadley said, "Yes." I said, "Theodore is currently kissing a woman in his showroom on a Tuesday afternoon, and has been kissing her in an apartment he secretly owns through a Nevada LLC for 14 months. Hadley said, "Yes." I said, "Theodore introduced me to one of his investors last spring as his wife, and did not say my name." Hadley said, "I remember you telling me that." I said, "I would like Theodore to find out about the $29 million in the moment that causes him the maximum possible reconsideration of the assumptions he has been operating under for the entirety of our marriage." Hadley said, "I thought you might say that." She smiled, the first smile I had seen on Hadley's face since the morning after the showroom. She said, "Then we go with option 2. The next 3 weeks were the most surreal 3 weeks of my life. I made Theodore breakfast every morning. I asked about his day every evening. I laughed at his jokes at a small dinner party we hosted for 2 of his investor friends in mid-November, and I went to his mother's house for an early Thanksgiving dinner, and I sat across the table from Theodore's mother, a woman named Eleanor, who had never quite warmed to me, and I asked her about her bridge club, and I praised her stuffing recipe, and I helped her clean up the kitchen afterward, in the specific, careful way of a daughter-in-law who has not yet been told that she is about to be a former daughter-in-law. Eleanor, that evening, said something to me that I have thought about many times since. She was at the sink. I was drying the dishes. The kitchen was warm, and the rest of the family was in the living room, and the two of us were alone for a moment, in a way that, in 9 years of marriage, we had not often been alone. She said, "Sloane." I said, "Yes, Eleanor." She said, "You have always been very good to my son." And I said, "I have tried to be." She said, "Theodore has not always known how to be good back. I want you to know that I see it. I have seen it for a long time." I stopped drying the dish in my hand. I said, "Eleanor, why are you telling me this?" She said, "Because I have been a mother for 47 years, and I have been Theodore's mother for 38 of those years, and I know my son. I know when he is doing something he should not be doing. I do not know what it is right now, but I know he is doing it, and I want you to know that whatever you decide to do about it, I will not stand in your way." I looked at Theodore's mother. I said, "Eleanor, thank you." She said, "I love my son. I will always love my son. But I have lived long enough to know that loving someone and protecting them from the consequences of their behavior are two different things. And the second thing is not a kindness. It is the opposite of one." She handed me another dish. We did not speak again for the rest of the evening, but I drove home that night, beside Theodore in the passenger seat of his car, with Theodore complaining about the traffic and the gas prices, and his cousin, who had been condescending at dinner, and I thought about Eleanor's hands at the sink, and the specific weight of what she had said to me, and I understood, perhaps for the first time, that the things I had been carrying alone for the past 3 months had been visible to other people for much longer than I had realized. The world, when something is wrong in your marriage, and does not actually conspire to keep you from knowing. The world tries, in small, careful ways, to tell you. You have to be willing to listen. I had not been willing to listen for a long time. I was willing now. The Friday came. The 3rd Friday of December. Theodore was hosting a holiday event at the dealership. A catered affair, champagne, a jazz quartet, the annual unveiling of a special edition vehicle that Carrington Motors had been selected by the manufacturer to display in advance of its public launch. The event was scheduled to begin at 6 in the evening and to run until 10. The event was the most important event on Theodore's calendar for the entire 4th quarter. Hadley had timed the filing for 2 p.m. By 3 p.m., the documents had been served on Theodore's attorney, Bradford Kemp. By 3:30, as Bradford Kemp had called Theodore. By 4 p.m., Theodore had locked himself in his office at the dealership. By 5 p.m., Theodore had emerged from his office and had attempted to locate me, which had not been successful, because at 5 p.m., I was in the back seat of a car driven by Roman Castellanos, en route to a hotel in Charleston, South Carolina, where Hadley had booked me a suite for the weekend, so that the filing could land on Theodore in my absence, and so that Theodore would not have the opportunity to confront me in any setting that he controlled. The event went on as scheduled. Theodore stood in the showroom by the espresso bar, in a charcoal suit and a tie I had bought him for his birthday, as he greeted his investors and shook hands with his most important clients, and posed for photographs beside the special edition vehicle. Camille was there. Camille wore a green dress. Camille stood at a careful distance from Theodore for the entire evening, because Camille had been informed at 4:15 p.m. by an attorney representing my interests that the filing included a request for Camille to be deposed regarding the duration and nature of her relationship with Theodore. And Camille had become, in the words of Roman Castellanos, who was present at the event in the capacity of a documenter, suddenly and visibly less interested in being seen near Theodore. Theodore made it through the event. Theodore did not make it through the rest of the weekend. By Sunday evening, Theodore had called me 11 times, and I had answered none of them. By Monday morning, Theodore had hired a second attorney because Bradford Kemp had explained to him over the weekend that the situation was significantly more complicated than the original separation he had been planning. By Monday afternoon, Theodore's second attorney had called Hadley to request a meeting. The meeting was scheduled for Wednesday morning. I flew back from Charleston on Tuesday night. I did not go home. I went to a small furnished apartment that Hadley had arranged for me in Midtown, a clean, quiet apartment on the 7th floor of a building Theodore did not know existed. I unpacked my small bag. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat by the window, and I watched the lights of the city come on in the specific way they come on in Atlanta in the 3rd week of December, and I thought about the Tuesday in October when I had stood in the corner near the espresso bar with a sandwich in my hand, and I thought about the woman I had been then, and I thought about the woman I was now. The two were not the same woman. The first one had needed to die so that the second one could be ready for what came next. The Wednesday meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning at Hadley's office. Theodore arrived with 2 attorneys. The original attorney, Bradford Kemp, who looked, when I saw him through the glass wall of the conference room, like a man who had not slept since Friday afternoon. And a second attorney whom I did not recognize, a woman in her late 40s with silver hair and a navy suit, who was introduced to me as Patricia Holloway, a divorce attorney who specialized. Hadley had told me on the way in, I would like to introduce some additional information that has come to our attention since the filing was prepared. She opened a folder. She slid a stack of documents across the table. Patricia Holloway picked them up. She put on her reading glasses. She began to read. The room was silent for the next 11 minutes. I want to tell you what was in the documents. The documents were the Roman Castellanos report on the Wyoming Holding Company, the 4 properties, the $4.6 million in real estate that Theodore had been hiding, the $31,000 a month in undeclared rental income, the Nevada LLC that owned the building where Camille Dupré lived, the 14-month timeline of Theodore's relationship with Camille Dupré, documented with photographs, with credit card receipts, and with hotel records from the 4 trips Theodore had taken with Camille Dupré to cities where there had been no dealer auctions scheduled. The documents were the architecture of Theodore's lie. Patricia Holloway finished reading. She removed her reading glasses. She set the documents down on the table. She looked at Theodore. She said, "Theodore, we need to step out of the room for a moment." Theodore said, "Patricia." Patricia said, "Now." She stood up. Bradford Kemp stood up. Theodore, after a moment, stood up. The 3 of them left the conference room. Hadley and I sat at the table in silence. After 14 minutes, the 3 of them returned. Patricia Holloway sat down. She said, "Miss Bishop, we are prepared to revise our settlement position significantly. My client is prepared to offer the marital home at full acknowledgement of the assets identified in the documents you have provided, an equitable division of the marital property, including the holdings of the Wyoming Corporation, and a structured payment plan for the undisclosed rental income that has accrued during the marriage." Hadley said, "Ms. Holloway, That is a reasonable starting position. There is, however, one additional matter that needs to be discussed before we can proceed. She opened a second folder. She slid a single document across the table. Patricia Holloway picked it up. I watched her face. The document was a one-page summary. It was the executive summary of the sale of my company. The buyer, the date, the amount, the Delaware holding company that had received the wire transfer, the current valuation of the assets in that holding company, which had grown, just over the 11 months since the sale, from $29 million to approximately $32 million, under the management of the financial advisor I had retained for that purpose. Patricia Holloway read the document. She read it a second time. She set it down on the table. She looked at me. She did not speak immediately. When she spoke, her voice had a different quality than it had had 3 minutes earlier. It had the specific quality of a woman who has just understood that the meeting she thought she was attending was a different meeting than the one she was actually attending. She said, "Mrs. Whitaker." I said, "Yes." She said, "This is your separate property." I said, "It is." She said, "The sale closed before any commingling of marital assets occurred with respect to the company." I said, "Yes," and she said, "Your husband was not aware of the sale." I said, "He was not." She said, "At any point during the marriage?" I said, "At no point during the marriage." Patricia Holloway turned to Theodore. Theodore was looking at the document on the table. He had not yet picked it up. He had not yet asked what it was. He was looking at it the way a person looks at an object they suspect is going to require something of them that they are not yet prepared to give. Patricia said, "Theodore, you should read this." Theodore picked up the document. I watched my husband's face. I have thought about that moment many times in the month since. I have thought about it because the moment was the moment I had been preparing for, in some unconscious part of myself, for the entire duration of my marriage. The moment when the man I had married would finally, irreversibly, see the specific shape and scale of the woman he had spent 9 years not seeing. His face did the thing. It did not do the thing I had expected. I had expected anger. I had expected denial. I had expected the particular performance of indignation that Theodore performed when his understanding of the world was contradicted by evidence. His face did not do any of those things. His face did the specific, quiet thing of a man who is, in real time, understanding that he has spent 9 years married to a woman he has not bothered to know, and that his not bothering has cost him, in a single document, more than he has earned in his entire career as the owner of a luxury car dealership in Atlanta. He looked up from the document. He looked at me. He said, "Sloane." I said, "Yes, Theodore." He said, "When did you sell the company?" And I said, "May of last year." He said, "For how much?" I said, "Theodore, the number is on the document in front of you." He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I sat with the question. I sat with it because I wanted to give him the right answer, the complete answer, the answer that, even if it changed nothing about what was about to happen, would at least leave Theodore with the truth of why I had not told him, so that he could carry the truth with him for the rest of his life, and consider it, at his leisure, in whatever rooms he found himself in after this one. I said, "Theodore, I did not tell you, because I had been watching you for a long time, and I had begun to understand that you were not the kind of husband who could be told. I did not tell you, because every time I had ever shared a piece of professional success with you, now you had received it with the specific small disturbance in your face that made me regret having shared it. I did not tell you, because by the time I sold the company, I had already begun to suspect that something was wrong in our marriage, and I had decided that the privacy of what I had built was the one thing I was going to keep until I understood what was happening. I said, I did not tell you, Theodore, because you never asked. I said, in 9 years of marriage, you never once asked me what my company actually was. You never asked how big it had gotten. You never asked what we were working on. You never asked how my employees were doing. You never asked, in any meaningful way, who I was at my work. You asked once whether I made enough money to cover my own car payment. I said, that was the entire scope of your interest, Theodore, for 9 years. I said, I had $29 million in a Delaware holding company because I had spent 10 years building something. And the man I had married had no idea because the man I had married had never bothered to find out. I said, that is why I did not tell you. The room was silent. Theodore did not respond. Patricia Holloway, who had been watching the exchange with the specific, careful neutrality of an attorney, who understood that the conversation in front of her was not about the law, finally cleared her throat. She said, Ms. Bishop, I would like to request a recess. I would like to consult with my client. Hadley said, of course. Theodore stood up. He moved slowly. He moved like a man who had been informed of a death. He paused at the door. He turned. He looked at me. He said, Sloane, I am sorry. And he said it the way Theodore said things, when he had not yet finished deciding what he meant by them. I said, Theodore, I know you are. I said it the way I had said it to him many times over 9 years of marriage, when he had apologized for things he was going to do again. I said it without inflection. I said it without warmth. I said it the way you say it, when you have already finished caring whether the apology is real. He left the room. The settlement was finalized 17 days later. I will give you the brief version, because the brief version is what matters. The marital home transferred to me. The Wyoming holding company was dissolved, and the 4 properties were liquidated, with the proceeds divided according to the documented commingling of marital and concealed assets. The undisclosed rental income was repaid, with interest, turned into a marital account that was then divided. The dealership remained with Theodore, with a structured payment to me, representing my interest in the marital portion of its appreciation during the marriage. The total settlement to me, exclusive of the $29 million that was already mine, came to approximately $3.8 million. The total cost to Theodore, between the settlement, the repayment of the undisclosed income, the legal fees, and the loss of the 4 properties, was approximately $5.1 million. But the cost to Theodore that mattered was not the money. The cost to Theodore that mattered was the moment in the conference room when he had looked at the 1-page document and had understood, for the first time in 9 years, the size of the woman he had married. I want to tell you about the second Tuesday in the showroom. It was a Tuesday in early September, 11 months after the first Tuesday. The Tuesday Roman had identified for me earlier in the week as the Tuesday when the silver Porsche that Theodore had purchased through the Wyoming holding company 2 years earlier, and that had been listed on the dissolution paperwork as part of the assets to be liquidated, was scheduled to be picked up by the auction company that had purchased it at the dissolution sale. I had not needed to be present. The pickup was a routine logistical event. Hadley had handled it. There was no legal requirement for me to be there. I went anyway. I drove to Carrington Motors at 2 p.m. I parked in the visitor lot. I walked across the marble floor that had been imported from the quarry in northern Italy. I stood in the corner near the espresso bar. The flatbed truck was outside. The auction company crew was loading the silver Porsche. Theodore was beside the car, on his phone, looking at something on the screen with the specific focused intensity of a man trying to avoid looking at the thing that was happening 3 feet in front of him. He saw me. He hung up the phone. He walked across the marble floor toward me. He stopped a careful distance away. He said, "Sloane, what are you doing here?" I said, "I came to drop something off." He said, "What?" I held out my hand. In my palm was a small object, a button, a single button, brass, slightly tarnished, the kind of button that had once belonged to a coat and had, somewhere in the long, quiet life of the coat, and come loose and been lost, and been found, and been kept in a small jar in a kitchen drawer, because it had not been clear, at the moment of finding, what its eventual purpose would be. Theodore looked at the button. He said, "What is that?" I said, "It is a button, Theodore." He said, "Why are you giving me a button?" I said, "Because for 11 months before everything happened, I had been collecting buttons in a jar, without knowing yet what I was going to do with them, without naming what they were. Each button was a thing I had noticed about you that did not match what I had been told about you. The phone you held a little too close to your chest. The trips to dealer auctions in cities where there were no dealer auctions. The receipts that did not match the explanations. The specific freshly showered cleanliness on Thursday evenings." And I said, "Each one was a button." I said, "I want you to have one." I said, "I want you to have it because I think there is a small possibility that sometime in the next 10 or 20 years, you might find yourself in a moment where you are about to not bother to find out who someone is. And I would like you to put your hand in your pocket in that moment and feel the button. And I would like you to remember that not bothering to find out is the most expensive thing a person can do in their life." I said, "It cost you everything, Theodore." I said, "I would prefer it not cost the next person, too." I placed the button in his hand. I closed his fingers around it. I turned. I walked across the marble floor. I walked past the espresso bar. I walked out the front door of Carrington Motors. I walked across the parking lot to my car. I got in my car. I drove home to my house. My house. The house that was now mine alone. And I parked in the driveway. And I sat for a moment in the quiet of the car. And I watched the magic hour finish in the Atlanta sky. The gold and the pink and then the blue. The same blue I had watched from the same driveway on the Tuesday, 11 months earlier. I went inside. I made myself dinner. I ate it at the kitchen table, alone, in the specific quiet pleasure of a woman who has, after a long, careful campaign, recovered her own life. I want to tell you what I learned, not as a list of lessons, as the things I know now that I did not know on the Tuesday in October, when I stood in the corner near the espresso bar with a sandwich in my hand. I learned that the woman in the corner with the sandwich had not been the truth of who I was, and the woman in the corner was a costume I had been wearing because the costume was easier, in the early years of the marriage, than the truth. The truth was that I had built a company. The truth was that I had sold it for a great deal of money. The truth was that I had been, the entire time I was bringing my husband sandwiches, a person with a head and a portfolio, and a Delaware holding company that was generating returns that exceeded my husband's annual income from the dealership. I had not been small. I had been pretending to be small. The pretending had cost me a marriage. It had also, eventually, given me back the marriage I had needed to lose. I learned that the men who do not bother to find out who their wives actually are not punished by the wives, and they are punished by the version of reality that eventually arrives in the form of a one-page document in a conference room. The wives are simply the people who are present when the punishment lands. I learned that the 11 months of suspicion I had carried before I named what I was carrying were not wasted months. They were the months I had needed to be ready for the moment when naming became necessary. Your body knows things before your mind is ready to know them. Your body collects buttons in a jar. The jar is not the problem. The not knowing what the jar is for is the problem. The day you understand what the jar is for is the day the jar becomes useful. And I learned that some women are the wives in the corner with the sandwiches, and some women are the women in the conference rooms with the one-page documents. And the difference between the two women is sometimes only a Tuesday afternoon and a particular shade of red lipstick and the willingness to pick up the phone and call the right attorney before the sun has finished setting. I learned that being underestimated by a man who chose to underestimate you is the most quietly powerful position a woman can occupy in her own life. He thinks you are small. You are not. He thinks you are simple. You are not. He thinks you are the wife in the corner with the sandwich. You are the woman with the Delaware holding company and the attorney who answers her own phone on a Tuesday evening. You have always been her. He just never bothered to find out. And the day you decide you are done waiting for him to bother is the day everything that was pretending to be your marriage finally stops pretending and becomes what it has always been underneath, which is a transaction that has reached the point of needing to be settled. I settled it. I am living now in the house that has my name on the deed, with the company sale proceeds in the holding company that bears no relation to the marriage that no longer exists, with a quiet career consulting for women who are building businesses they have not yet told their husbands about. I am 34 years old. I am the woman in the showroom now. I am the woman with the keys. The button is in Theodore's pocket somewhere, or in a drawer in his apartment, or thrown away by now. I do not know, and I do not particularly care. The button was never for me. Yes, the button was a small, permanent gift to a man who needed to carry the weight of a single specific lesson for the rest of his life. I hope he carries it. I suspect he does not. That is fine. The button was the gift. The carrying was always going to be his choice. Some men carry. Some men throw the button away. The throwing away does not change what the button was. It only tells you, with absolute clarity, what kind of man the man was the entire time.